Evolutionary psychology also shows why the grandchildren of immigrants to America often don't learn the native language of their grandparents. My dad saw this happen in his own family. My great-grandmother immigrated here from France, so French was her native language, and then she learned English. She spoke French at home, and my grandfather learned it from her. He learned English at the same time from other people. So he learned both languages together, and his mother spoke French, but more people he knew spoke English. Then my grandfather met my grandmother. My grandmother didn't know French, so my grandfather didn't have anyone to speak French to at home. So my dad didn't learn French at home, he only learned English. He learned French in high school, but he already knew English by then. So my great-grandmother learned French first and then English. My grandfather learned French and English at the same time, and my dad learned English first and then French. So that meant my great-grandmother's native language was French, my grandfather's native languages were both French and English, and my dad's native language was English. Your native language doesn't depend on where your ancestors came from, but at what point in your life you learned the language. The language you learned first is the language you feel you're supposed to use. So that feels like your native language, and any language you learn later feels like a foreign language. Now, where else do you see that pattern of children acting differently from their parents because they learned something at a different time in their lives? In the kingdoms of Europe, this caused a big problem with inherited rulership. Suppose a noble overthrew a king and made himself king. To overthrow the king, he had to be a great leader and a great warrior. Then his oldest son grows up to be the next king. The first king had to work really hard to make himself king, but his son didn't have to do anything to get to be king. So the first king of a dynasty would be a great leader, and then it would all go downhill from there, and all their descendants would grow up to be corrupt kings because they grew up with the attitude that they were supposed to be king no matter what. And then we had this guy for president, who was a successful businessman. And then we had this guy for president, and all his businesses went bankrupt. Where else do you see that happen? A lot of parents in America work really hard to make a lot of money so they can give their children a better life than they had growing up. And then suddenly they have a lot of problems in their family that they never expected. Their children grow up to be lazy, or their children get bored and get into a lot of trouble, and no matter what, the children just don't appreciate all the stuff they have the way their parents think they should. That's because the parents grew up one way, and then got all that stuff as adults, but their children had all that stuff right from the beginning. So the children have no idea what it's like to grow up the way their parents did, because the parents made sure the children wouldn't grow up that way. So just remember, the American dream is not as simple as it looks. For your children to grow up to be happy, healthy adults doesn't depend on their having a certain amount of stuff. It depends on their learning how to use their abilities, skills, and resources to reach their goals. Everyone needs resources to be able to live. But the other part of it is, what do you learn how to do with the resources you have? Where else do you see this pattern? You know all those people who act like being white proves they're supposed to dominate the world? There was another big problem a lot of people in America had with racism before the NAFTA. A lot of white people said there were too many Asian immigrants going to college in America. They'd come over here and they'd go to college to major in science and engineering, and then you know what they'd do? They'd take a lot of jobs that white people used to do. Well, if Asians were the ones who were willing to work hard enough to graduate from college, what was anyone going to do about that? Lower our educational standards to make it easier for lazy white people to graduate from college? or prohibit the people who are willing to work the hardest from going to college. What's that going to solve? Either way, that would result in the people who worked the hardest not being able to get the jobs that people had to work hard to be able to do. Like I said, looking like the people who conquered the world isn't good enough. But once again, some people's ancestors worked hard to get something, and then their children grew up with that thing from the very beginning. So those people believe that having that thing is how the world is supposed to be. And then if they don't have that thing, they feel like something is going seriously wrong with the world. Evolutionary psychology also answers the question of how we got into the environmental crisis in the first place and why we're having so much trouble getting out of it now. With the greenhouse effect, we are in the same relationship with the environment that the AIDS virus gets into with us. The Earth probably isn't going to infect other planets with us, but that's not the point. The point is, we're using resources and generating pollution in a way that seems like a good idea to us in the short term, but is threatening to kill us in the long run. The reason we're doing that to the Earth is the same reason the AIDS virus does that to a person. We have brains, but we can't foresee the long-term effects our actions have on the world well enough to keep from making decisions that benefit us in the short term, but are adding up to disaster. Those unexpected long-term effects are throwing the environment out of balance. The reason we perceive the world this way is because our brains evolved about 40,000 years ago. At that point, people got smart enough to be able to think their decisions through ahead of time and figure out whether one decision or another would be the best for their survival and reproduction. People could still make mistakes and get themselves into trouble, but at this point, people were smart enough to keep themselves out of trouble more often than not by choosing between ideas rather than trying the first idea that came to mind and finding out the hard way if it worked or not. This means we are all born with brains that are well suited to our living conditions as of 40,000 years ago. Over the past 40,000 years, we have been developing our ideas, teaching them to people, learning them from people, and combining them, but none of that has been recorded in our genes. Ideas change the brains of individual people, but they don't change the brain structure of our species. So what we have is a world full of people all using their caveman instincts combined with whatever they have learned to decide how to use 21st century technology. You could make up for what you don't know intuitively with education. Then you can use your survival and reproductive instincts to interpret what you know about the greenhouse effect and then decide what you want to do about it. Then your education will match your technological level. But if you don't get the education, your instincts alone can't solve the problem.